7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Howdy, CROC Nation. Dr. Tommy and Ellie here with you with another CROC podcast alongside, on the other side of the glass, my friend and your friend, Mr. Angel Santana. Have faith, let it begin. Angel, how are you tonight?
I am tired, but good and great and ready to rock and roll with another episode of the CROC Podcast.
So I understand that you were on a field trip with your daughter today and you were at the zoo. What great things did you see?
What didn't we see? We saw bisons, we saw reptiles, we saw sea lions. She pet stingrays, and we rode the choo-choo train, and she face painted. We did it all.
Oh my God, what a great dad you are. And I'm I'm simultaneously excited and yet a little apprehensive about today's podcast. Excited because I learned something really, really remarkable this week from a patient. And as you know, I like to share those lessons. But it is going to be a bit of a painful lesson. It's a lesson that I never thought I would have to learn. It's when you believe in something so strongly that every fiber of your body you think is correct. And when something happens and it comes to your attention that you've been absolutely wrong or partially wrong, it's a very humbling moment. And I know that everyone listening has had those experiences. And what we try to do here for our cancer survivor thrivers is to share these moments of insight to perhaps help our survivors, through their journey and through their treatments and beyond. And tonight, actually, we're going to be taking a little bit of a different position. Each week we come to you and try to provide the survivor thriver with the tools that they need to be successful and to get through each day. But today, the Swiss Army knife is going to be given not to our survivor thrivers, but to my colleagues, to the oncology community, to the people who take care of these fine people, to the people who are in the trenches and in the foxholes with me. And I'm going to be basically speaking to you. And Angel, believe it or not, this is a position I never thought I would have. But tonight, we're going to be talking about a subject that I didn't even think I would ever even entertain having a podcast that in any way would distance an oncology professional from our beloved survivor thrivers. You have to understand that I have spent my entire career advocating and breaking down walls against a disease that is heartless and cruel and evil. Cancer is a disease that does not discriminate and does not play fair. It's a disease that is so hideous, just the mention of the word is enough to bring families to their knees. A disease so complex and capricious that the treatments themselves provoke fear due to the level of disfigurement and toxicity and lifelong harm. But tonight, we are going to be taking a position that I believe that I learned from a patient, that being able to care for our survivor thrivers, we know is a noble calling. It is not a job. It is something that we have been made, or we've been called by our creator to do. I believe this so much that I developed 4 pillars that support our entire organization around this privilege and this honor of taking care of these patients, to such a degree that I have been preaching over the last 4 years on this podcast and 25 years as a cancer support advocate with evangelical zeal, that these revolutionary tenets, especially the ones that we talk about when we say we want to encourage approachability and demand accessibility. And I've been yelling and screaming and stomping my feet in tantrums of passion about breaking down these boundaries and to break down these barriers. And now tonight, I'm actually going to have the audacity to have a podcast about actually setting up boundaries. And I know what you're going to say. have I lost my mind? And I just want you to stick with me and listen to the story. All I ask is that you try to hear me out before you judge me and listen. So I was inspired this week by a patient that I took care of last year. When I first met this patient, he was a little different. He was a little demanding, but that was fine. And I sat with him and I gave him everything he needed. I gave him the time. I gave him my energy. I gave him my expertise. He started our relationship negotiating, and his negotiations I was able to manage. I thought them strange, but I didn't think much of it. The negotiations weren't just about his care as a cancer survivor and how we were going to integrate treatments that were going to cure him of his cancer, but he started to unveil a side that I didn't really comprehend at the time. He started trying to make some side deals. He started by coming up with stories about he was fighting with his disability and he wanted certain paperwork done in a certain way with certain wording. And I was able to sort of set him straight and say, listen, this is not the way we work. This is what we're going to do. This is the way we're going to take care of you. But we're not going to have any consideration of doing any paperwork, talking about your back pain or how you fell on the job and your, workman's compensation. That has nothing to do with what we're doing here. We're here to cure your cancer. And that was the first red flag. But he seemed satisfied with my explanation and with the standards that I held him to and held myself to. And then he got through his treatment. And of course, he became cured. Maybe about a week ago, I got a call from him, not about him, but about his wife and his wife's illness. Now, you have to understand, I was not his wife's doctor. I have never even met his wife. And he started complaining about the doctors that were taking care of his wife. And he wanted me to refer his wife to another doctor, which I did. And I did that happily. Our survivor thrivers are entitled for us to fight for not only for them, but also for their family members. But then it started to get weird. I kept on getting calls about his wife. I kept on getting calls about his disappointment and the way she was being managed and how her health care was being managed and how the doctors were caring for them and how angry he was at the doctors. And then it got to the point he even started getting angry at me. For what? I don't know. And I said to myself, there's something wrong here. There's something that's just there, as they say, the expression is there's something smelling fishy in Denmark. And I said to myself, let me do some digging because I really don't feel comfortable here. And this relationship is really going down the toilet fast. And I need to investigate what's going on here. And it was at that moment, Angel, that I had this moment of realization, this moment of insight, that I had to make a foundational change in my thinking, not just for myself, but on behalf of my colleagues who stand arm in arm with me in the trenches, in the foxholes of our oncologic caretaking, and with our life and death responsibility that we have to manage each day personally. And I realized for the first time in my career that indeed, under certain circumstances, they require boundaries, not just for the sake of the survivor thriver, but for our sake as well. And to be clear, these boundaries that I'm talking about really have nothing to do with the 4 tenets of CROC and all of the things that we've been trying to uphold here and try to revolutionize here on the CROC podcast. I'm only talking about certain circumstances. We'll call them the exceptions to the rule. And the CROC pillars remain intact. They remain strong. They remain immovable and immutable. And let's just take a look, Angel, at when to set these boundaries and why to set these boundaries. Any input so far?
No, I mean, I think I'm gonna save my words for the end because I've got a lot of things in my mind right now. But I appreciate your honesty and the fact that you're able to come on and share this moment with us.
So we're going to start, Angel, with the why. So why we have to set up these occasional boundaries is very simple. It's for caretaker burnout. We cannot allow burnout to take us out of the game, because if we get burnt out, we're not going to be of no use to anyone. We're not going to be any use to our patients, and we're not going to be any use to our families and our friends, and we're not going to be any use to ourselves. And I think what happens, especially with cancer professionals, is that we lose a sense of ourselves because of what we do. We lose a loss of who we are. We become blurred. We think what we do is who we are. And that's actually not true. Who we are and what we do are two completely separate entities. And it is this blurring, it is this commitment to what we do that sometimes confuses us and makes us think what we do is who we are. And when we talk about burnout and how we have to avoid it, we look at a bunch of different burdens. So we're going to talk about the cognitive burden. We're going to talk about the philosophical burden, the bureaucratic burden, the burden of time, and the post-COVID reality, which I call the impossibility burden. And we're going to look at all of these reasons of how we can get burned out and how we can avoid being burned out by setting some of these boundaries that I thought I would never have to even talk about or investigate. So let's start with technology and knowledge. So the cognitive burnout. The practice of medicine is globally moving at the speed of light, and no more so than in the practice of oncology. The pressure of staying up to date and relevant with all the new technological advancements and all the new techniques, all of the data that is just spewing out of the journals and the studies on a daily basis is mind-boggling. No longer do we get our information from textbooks. Our textbooks that we learn from in medical school and college and residency are outdated the moment that they're actually put on the shelves. There is information just streaming through the internet all over the place. All of the webinars and published data, which is our responsibility to know, is just putting a pressure, an unsustainable pressure on oncologists and oncology professionals to stay, as I said, up to date and relevant. And I call that the cognitive burden. Then there's the philosophical burden. As I said a million times on this podcast, even on tonight's podcast, who we care for, the survivor thriver, is why we do this. I have rarely met a colleague who wasn't 100% vested in the survivor thriver above self and above everything associated with self, whether it be to our families, whether it be to our hobbies, whether it be to our other passions outside of medicine. There is nothing that is above our cancer survivor and thriver. And the pressure of trying to live a balanced life as an oncologist is rarely achieved. Angel, the math just doesn't work. Then we talk about the bureaucratic burden, the burden of the broken system. And this is where our podcast, I think, is at its strongest, is when we are able to lend our expertise to point out some of the things that are wrong in healthcare. There's now the loss of autonomy. Insurance companies are making our lives absolutely a living nightmare by taking away the decision-making process on what's best for our patient and putting it into the hands of an entity that has, that has an agenda which is not, is not first and foremost to the survivor thriver, but to the almighty dollar. And then there's the loss of cooperation between systems. I have patients that I want to send into New York City, which is literally 1 hour away from where we practice, to one of the big centers, and they seldom answer their phones or, accept patients, or just make it so hard we have to jump over hoops, to get a patient seen for a particular, clinical study at one of the big centers. There's also a loss of collegiality between our services. There was a day, when a doctor would call a doctor and say, hey, I need you to see this patient today. And it wasn't even a question. It would be, tell them to bring a book, tell them to bring a sandwich, tell them to come to my door. I'll see them. I don't know when I'm going to see them, but they will be seen today. You don't see that anymore. There's also a loss of respect by our patients. There's an anger by our patients towards physicians. There's almost sort of that attitude like that doctors, they're spoiled and they make so much money and they don't care about their patients. And it's unfortunate because, a few bad apples certainly spoil the entire bushel for sure. And there are doctors that are that way, but I have rarely met an oncologist who has those issues. There's also a lack of fairness in the medical legal arena. Physicians are being sued and taken to court for ridiculous reasons that should never see the light of day. And it's a tremendous burden and emotional destroyer of our worlds to be called out on what we love most to do, and to be called incompetent by the press, or be called incompetent by a court system. There's a lack of equity in healthcare with health disparities of care. And we did 3 podcasts with Len Barry about this, especially as it relates to caring for the poor and elderly. And then there's the skepticism of the model of selflessness. So that model that I was trained with and everyone before me was trained with, that model isn't working anymore. The young doctors, and I'm not going to judge them, they're not really holding sacred the same things that we did, and the sacrifices that we made, to the bereft of our own personal lives, they're no longer willing to do. And if you put all those together, that's what I call the bureaucratic burden, which lays heavy on us and contributes to this burnout. And then there's the burden of time. There's just not enough time to do everything we need to do these days with all the other things we discussed, between fighting insurance companies and taking care of patients and trying to get approvals and getting the studies done and getting the studies read and referring the patients to other doctors, and then not closing loops. It's just not enough time. So there's another reason that will lead to burnout, that will require us to set certain boundaries to protect ourselves and, believe it or not, protect our patients. And lastly, the impossibility burden, the post-COVID world. I don't think any physician, even epidemiologist, ever expected to see a disease, a pandemic to the degree that we saw with COVID and what it did to our world. I don't think any physician ever believed that with our technology and our knowledge, which was so much more than the knowledge and technology of the 1928 influenza, pandemic that killed X percentage of the population. I think everyone in their minds read these stories and read these case reports and read these books and said, boy, that must have been awful. Thank God I'm never going to see this. And guess what? We saw it. We didn't just see it. We lived it. We lost thousands and thousands of healthcare workers, doctors and nurses. We saw the fear they must have had going in. And I wasn't on the front lines. I was sort of on the front lines in oncology, but I wasn't in the ERs and the ICUs where they had to put on all of this protective gear and work their 24-hour shifts or whatever, 36-hour shifts, caring for dying patients. And then, imagine if they felt warm or if they developed a cough, they probably were thinking their time is up, that their card was punched and they were ready to, they're ready to go to meet their maker. And this impossibility became a possibility, and all of our healthcare workers dying the same side by side by their patients. And it turned the world upside down. It changed the way we connect with each other. It changed everything. And if you put this all together, it all leads to the inevitability of this personal destruction that's rendering us unable to care for anyone, because we have become broken. We have become burnt out, and we have lost our faith in what we do. But if we can discern when to set these boundaries, when we need to hold even our beloved survivor thrivers responsible for their behavior and prevent these manipulations and prevent the subterfuge, we will resurrect ourselves and not get let down or led down the road where we are not only not helping our patients, not only not taking care of our health, but actually hurting our patients and hurting ourselves. And I would absolutely love to talk about 6 where I think boundaries need to be set in 6 instances. I've only had a safety issue with 2 patients over my over 35 years, 40 years of medical care. And in each of these instances, I was placed in situations where I could have been harmed. By the grace of God, that never happened. And I was able to set up a situation where those patients that were threatening were taken out of our world. They were taken into, they were discharged from our clinic. But any physician, any healthcare worker, any oncologist who feels that they are unsafe by the unreasonable, thought processes or beliefs of a patient who might have mental illness, or a patient who, may have had expectations that did not align with reality, you need to immediately set a boundary and protect yourself. When I was coming into, at the time, Horton Hospital, one of the buildings was named after a physician who was actually shot and killed by a mentally ill patient because they felt that the outcome of the poor outcome of one of their loved ones was due to the fault of the doctor, which indeed it wasn't. The second category I want to talk about is irresponsibility. Got a call last weekend. A patient's daughter called me and in sort of even laughing, saying, "Oh, I forgot to tell you yesterday that, I need this medication renewed." And I said, I will do it for you tomorrow. I'm not going to do it for you today. I can't get into my computer. But why didn't you ask us this on Thursday or Friday or Wednesday or Tuesday? Did you not know that your father's medication was running out? And, obviously it wasn't a life-threatening situation, but it was irresponsible of that patient's family member. And we need to set boundaries to make sure that our patients and their family members realize that, we're here for them. We're here 100% entirely for them, but they do have to come and meet us halfway, and they do have responsibilities as well. The patient that we discussed that started this whole podcast fits under category 3, and that's entitlement. I think that the patient, felt that because we had a relationship, and it was a very good, trusting relationship, where, we had set up a situation where the patient knew what was going on, the patient knew the treatments, the patient got cured as predicted, and the patient did well. And they felt that because of that, that I owed them something, that I owed them the responsibility of not only caring for them, but also caring for their wife. And that's absolutely not true. I did not have a healing relationship with his wife. I had never met his wife. The fact that I tried to do him a favor by referring him to another physician, I probably shouldn't have done. And I should have just bowed out and just set my boundary then. But better late than never. And that's a warning for you all. Entitlement. Watch out for entitled patients. Manipulators and grifters. There are patients out there that want to take your medical license and use it for their benefit, use it for their disability, to stay out of work, to get workman's compensation. Be aware and set your boundaries. Drug seekers. Sadly, there are patients that are not only cancer patients / survivor thrivers, but also perhaps hooked on narcotic medications, and their addictions, unfortunately are stronger than their sense of fair play. And what they'll try to do is manipulate you to, to write a prescription. And New York State has an excellent rule. I believe it might even be countrywide, where they have the PMP, where we check before we write a narcotic to make sure that the patient isn't getting these narcotics from other providers. And if they are, all of a sudden that avenue just gets cut down. That's a boundary. And I think it's a righteous boundary. And last but not least, The patients that I really have a hard time letting go of, and these are wonderful people, wonderful, wonderful people, but they're not compliant. They do not listen. They don't come in for their appointments. They miss their appointments. They come in late for their appointments. You try to set them up for studies. You try to set them up for testing. You try to take care of them, but they don't let you take care of them because they don't do what you tell them to do. In these cases, you need to set up a boundary, because even though you think you're helping them and you're not giving up on them, and you feel that if you are to discharge them from your practice, that you're losing your heart and you become mean and awful and everything that Dr. Iannelli is screaming about every week about not to become. But guess what? You're not doing them any good. You're not only not helping them, you're hurting them, and you're putting yourself at risk for liability. And even more important than liability, you're putting yourself in a position of delivering substandard care. So, Angel, just to put it all together, I learned something very important from this patient this week. I learned something very important from this story. I learned that the most unhealthy thing a healer can do is stop questioning what we believe our methods to be, that we believe our methods and beliefs to be perfect. I believe that I learned that to stop thinking that everything I believe in is right, or even if it was right once, it must be right forever. That's not true. We need to continue to be skeptical of our thought processes and be skeptical of our beliefs, because they may be wrong or they may turn wrong, and we may need to make these adjustments. And we have to admit to ourselves that a belief so strong, a belief that I truly in my heart thought that a cancer survivor thriver could do no wrong, that should never have a boundary set, should never have anyone stop advocating for them, is actually unhealthy. And it's actually dangerous for not only for the provider, but also for the patient. And lastly, I learned to be more wary of these red flags and to quickly squelch any possible interaction that could result in our burnout or in their poor outcome or their harm. Angel Santana, your thoughts?
You know, we have at one point heard the phrase, learn from your mistakes. On this podcast, many times we've heard the term, know your doctor. And as a patient, and not a physician, we have to know what our availabilities are. We also have to know the difference between what is right for us, medically speaking, and what is right as a team. When you do one random act of kindness, we do everything in our part to try to make things right, make things better for each individual. What makes things very difficult is when we cannot meet each other halfway. And one of the things that I think I've gotten out of this is that not only does this work as you, the physician, humbling yourself and sharing with us what you have experienced, but I think we have to use this also as a life lesson to understand that it's a team effort, and it all begins with each of us as individuals, because as you can see, it can be taken to a different level and ultimately could affect your well-being, your mental situation, and your medical situation. So in closing, I would say this: know your doctor, know your limitations, have open communication with your doctor, and know that your doctor is not the enemy. And you, the patient, can only be your worst enemy if you choose not to listen to the person that took an oath to do the best they could for your medical needs.
Angel, thank you for your wise words as always. And I just want to end with my pep talk. So this was a very different podcast. It's a podcast that probably I've never made before, because I've never done a podcast where I haven't been 100% behind the survivor thriver. But there are instances, and very, very seldom and very unusual instances where a survivor thriver may be coming to the table not with the best or purest of intentions. Perhaps there is a survivor thriver who is just overwhelmed and just is looking, to just stay afloat and will do anything possible to do that, even at the risk of drowning their physician or their oncologist or their oncologic healthcare worker. There are instances where our safety as oncologists and as oncology professionals are limited or maybe even actually threatened by a mentally ill patient or a patient who's unhappy or doesn't have appropriate expectations. There are times when there are patients, as much as I'd like to tell you that every person that I meet on earth, I'd like to think have the purest of intentions. Sometimes that's not true. And we have to be very, very wary of those situations so we don't put ourselves at risk for burnout or for personal harm. And then there are circumstances where patients just need us to be understanding, and our survivor thrivers just need us to help set those boundaries, to help them know what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. By setting these certain boundaries at certain circumstances, in certain instances, at certain times, we not only can help ourselves become better caregivers, become better oncology professionals, become more effective healthcare professionals, but also produce better outcome for our survivor thrivers. Angel Santana, have faith, let it begin. Thank you for everything, as always. To the board of directors, thank you for your expertise, your talents, your time, and of course, your special work and sacrifice for our survivor thrivers. For our survivor thrivers, you guys are amazing. You guys are awesome. You guys are special. You guys are brave. You are loved. You are worthy. If you happen to be a person or a patient who has sometimes exhibited these types of red flags, I hope this has helped you too, to be able to see something in yourself that you could change, just as I saw something in myself that I needed to change. And I'd like to end this podcast as I end every podcast, and that's with a prayer, wishing each and every one of you out there a long, healthy, happy, and cancer-free life. God bless you. God be with you. Peace.